2 days until we move. So I can't help at this point but digress a little bit. I know I was talking to you about Florida, and I was talking to you about obsession with marijuana, and I was talking to you about the depression and psychological issues that were sort of starting to transpire at that time, and some of the philosophical, problematic philosophical thoughts that were transpiring at that time, including my determinism and my nihilism, specifically. However, I mean, we're leaving this place in 2 days now, and it is just taking over and seizing my consciousness. You can see I find this kind of architecture, if you will, and this kind of infrastructure, the brick, I find it ugly. I find the landscaping ugly. I find the geography ugly. I appreciate that this is a very safe area. I appreciate that people are friendly, I think, around here, but I'm not inspired aesthetically by it. I'm not. And there's a lot of emotions and a lot of thoughts and a lot of ideas that are swarming my mind as we get closer to moving. Now we're 2 days till moving, leaving East Windsor, New Jersey, and I've been talking to you about moving to a better place and placeness and moving and what it means to live somewhere, and what it means to live somewhere because there was no other place for you to go, versus moving someplace and living someplace because you thought it's where you wanted to be, versus moving someplace because it had something to do with really thinking a lot about where you wanted to live and fully vetting that idea. So that's the topic here. The philosophical idea here is a question of what does it mean to want to live somewhere? What does it mean to think about where you live and ask yourself, am I happy here? Why am I happy here, or why am I not happy here? Where would I prefer living and why? Where have I lived? What do I know about my options with respect to where I might want to live? These are some questions that come to mind. Now, with respect to like how I'm feeling and what I'm thinking more personally as this move gets closer and closer, is one of it's part of it is disbelief. Like, you won't believe it until you see it. We've been here a long time, and I've just not been particularly happy about it. So I've been praying to God, so to speak, to get the hell out of here for almost a decade. It's been 7 years. So, I mean, this East Windsor life has been rather cemented in my subconscious, I think. It is actually hard to imagine living somewhere else. Well, it's not hard to imagine, but it's hard to believe this notion of living somewhere else. It's hard even to believe that I have lived somewhere else. I was talking to you about life in Florida. I can't reiterate to you enough how much that's been like as if it was another life altogether. I don't even identify with who that person was. I feel no visceral connection or relation to Sean O'Connor as he was at that point in time, other than the fact that I deeply regret having been that person and having been that way. again, ironically, even if I don't remember, or rather I don't connect to what it was like. I do need one of those selfie sticks, I think, to make this a more pleasant walking experience. So that's a major emotion. I mean, also, I really want to live in Basking Ridge. When we scoped out the area, you have to understand, we were scoping out online, looking for where might we want to live. And we were looking at pictures and looking at places that were available. And if you've ever fallen in love at first sight, and you just, something captivated your eyes and you said that, I mean, that was the experience for us. And it was, even then, it was hard to believe, in fact, we could actually live there. Then we went and we drove out there to give it a look. And, you know, in contrast to this more congested, flat area, ugly, dark, see here, in contrast to that, Basking Ridge is mountainous and open and cleaner. It's got a feel of like being newer, and I suppose you could say that it's probably wealthier. Anyway, that's really what's going on, you know, in my mind about it. Additionally, I should say there's this spiritual aspect of it where it's such a, again, because we've been here in East Windsor for so long, and because it's been like something I've not really liked for so long, because along with moving, we're getting rid of a lot of things, throwing out a lot of things, and we'll be getting some new things, a new couch, a new table. So because this isn't just a move down the road across the street, but rather from one geographical area that has distinct scenic qualities that are so different from this place. And because even, you know, we'll be owning this property too, we'll be owning this condo, but moreover, because we'll have so many, there's just going to be so much change that, you know, I mean, wow, for so much change, right, speaking philosophically, this, we are taken into the world of Heraclitus, and how we are reminded that reality is ever in flux, isn't it? That doesn't mean, of course, that we can't have certain guiding principles that are probably going to be true for a significant amount of time, and that will be constructive for us in our thinking. But it is also the case that things do change, and it's just funny when things go so long without changing, right? Because we've been here since 2013. So when things go so long without changing, and then suddenly they do change, and they don't change just slightly, they don't change just mildly, but they change rather intensely and significantly and in a wide ranging and rather comprehensive way. That's intense. It's extremely stimulating. It's actually very emotional too. I mean, how do I feel emotionally? I feel, well, obviously, I don't know if it's obvious, but as you might guess, I feel extraordinarily excited, elated even. It just feels like almost like a new life is on its way. It feels like this new life is about to happen. And as this happens to a company just recently having graduated college, as this just happens to fall around the time also that I've really started investing more heavily in my talking head video blogging and really going very directly into my philosophical ideas more directly and thoroughly and with more confidence. Just all of this change is happening at once. It's almost like a little personal kind of revolution of sorts. I've had very few in my life experiences like this. And I was talking to you about Florida and transferring to Florida Gulf Coast University. And that would be another example of a time in my life that was actually revolutionary. It wasn't a good revolutionary period, though. It was a dark revolutionary period. This period is sort of interesting. It almost feels like the complete opposite, in that whereas when I moved to Fort Myers to live at Florida Gulf Coast University, that was like the beginning of this awful downfall that led me to, in fact, being stuck in East Windsor for almost a decade. And so this is like the opposite kind of revolution now, where I imagine the move that we're making now is going to lead, I don't know what other aspects of life will change as a result of this move, but I hypothesize that it's going to be wonderful, and I hope that my hypothesis is proven correct. In contrast, though, when I moved to Estero, Fort Myers, Florida Gulf Coast University, it was just not a vetted idea. It was actually, it wasn't impulsive, as I explained to you, because I knew that I had wanted to live by the beach, somewhere ideally tropical, and get a sense of adventure. But the thing is, it wasn't a fully vetted idea, in that I wasn't really probing the question of why I should be at college in the first place. I wasn't really probing how I viewed myself making money. I wasn't probing the question of where I might see myself in 5 years. I wasn't probing really how I viewed myself as contributing something to society. I wasn't probing I wasn't even aware of society. I was utterly oblivious in those days. I didn't know what was going on politically. I knew who the president and vice president were, Bush and Cheney. I knew that we were in war in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I didn't know what the political questions of the time were back in 2005, 2006. I knew that Hurricane Katrina had hit. I knew the things that everybody seemed to know. But I lived under a rock. I was oblivious. My head was in the clouds when I dashed off to Florida Gulf Coast University. And so as I'm growing increasingly obsessed with marijuana, look, marijuana is going to affect everybody very differently. But for me, the problem is that it oftentimes induced mad paranoia, as I was telling you about. You start to feel very dizzy. Time is so dramatically distorted that you don't believe you're in the reality that you knew. I didn't believe I was in reality anymore. It seemed that if time was slowing down this way, then it could only mean that life must be ending. The world must be ending. That's really how it felt. And so then there's this increasing degree of I don't know if you want to call it sentimentality, if you will. The people who were there when I had that first initial breakdown and paranoia and panic attack, the second time I had smoked pot, but I started crying and sobbing and saying, I don't want to die, I don't want to die. I was terrified. And I just couldn't stop thinking about how I might never see these people again. And I felt this intense spiritual love for everybody in the room, that I was getting high with or whatever. And I just thought about how we all had this mortality, and each of us was going to die, and each of us was just part of this eternal story of time and the universe. And I thought, what would life be like 10 years from now if I was still alive and I never saw these people again? And how this experience of knowing somebody, even as an acquaintance, the pleasure of getting to know them and the sadness of knowing you may never see them again. And there was these intense emotions, and that was what it was like. But then it all subsides and everything is very tranquil. And you think, this is why I did it. This is why I got high. Because everything is so serene and relaxed. And there's not a thing at this moment in time that could bother me. And the only thing that matters now are the little thoughts that dribble out that I can write down on a notebook and view myself as this all wonderful, all genius, revolutionary poet of sorts. And so I started smoking pot all the time. And these experiences would be up and down. Sometimes I had these awful panic attacks and thought I was dying, and would cry and would feel this utter terror and pray to God that I wasn't the end for me. And other times it was that serenity, that amazing feeling that I was an atheist in those days, but if I wasn't, I suppose I would have felt a connection with God. Oneness with the universe, perhaps was how I viewed it. Utterly in touch with my subconscious mind, I guess I thought. And utterly uninhibited with respect to access to my thoughts. I wasn't worrying about what I was thinking, I was just thinking it and writing it down. So it's this up and down experience with marijuana, and I was doing it more and more, attending class less and less, and increasingly high all the time. And the really bad thing would be the paranoia that would come, because the paranoia would get more complex and sophisticated and dark. So I started, for example, growing convinced that I was mentally retarded. I hate that phrase. I shouldn't have used that. I apologize. That I was, intellectually disabled somehow, and severely so. And I would stare at myself in the mirror, and I would think, I am so stupid. I suffer from a severe mental, intellectual problem. I'm not competent. I can't even grasp basic concepts. And all this time, all my life, no one has ever been blunt with me about it. And people have been nice to me merely to be polite and not hurt my feelings. But in fact, there's something severely wrong with me. And I just can't do basic things. And I'm going to need help. I'm going to need extraordinary amounts of assistance all my life to do basic operations, to do basic things. I'm never going to be able to take care of myself and be independent. And that made me very depressed and withdrawn. And I grew very cynical of people. I had this I'm about to cough, excuse me. Sorry about that. This deepening cynicism because of the paranoia. I didn't just suffer from a paranoia about myself, but of other people. So as time goes on, and I'm at Florida Gulf Coast University, for example, I end up in my first super serious romantic relationship, and that was a deluge of cynicism and paranoia. As nice as it was to finally experience a romantic relationship with that kind of depth, which I think there was there, all I could think about was this fear that all she wanted to do was sleep with other guys the whole time, and that all I was going to want to do was sleep with other girls the whole time. And I found that the idea of us committing to this monogamous relationship, I believed, was a lie that we were telling ourselves, and that deep down it was all just a bunch of BS, and that this relationship was not one that I could find any confidence in or believe in. And so I was severely depressed and paranoid and suspicious of everything. All the while, keep in mind, I've completely stopped going to class. So I'm living on campus at Florida Gulf Coast University, not attending any of my classes, smoking pot all the time, fearing the worst within people all the time, fearing the worst of myself all the time, and having no vision whatsoever of the future for myself in any constructive sense. So I'm just there, stoned out of my mind in these awful, incapacitated psychological states. And really the only comfort that I could ever take was the beautiful palm trees and the alligators and the sense of wilderness. And even that started to scare the hell out of me. I began to think that Fort Myers, Estero, Naples, I began to think all of this Gulf Coast area of West Florida, I began to believe that it was actually damned, that it was cursed, that evil spirits were lurking about. And so I grew increasingly paranoid. And, so I told you I had no sense of a goal at this point in life. Then I start to get this wild idea that I'm going to move to Europe. I'm going to move to England, and I'm going to be a traveling poet. And then my girlfriend at the time was just going to film me being this traveling poet, and I was going to become famous and rich in doing this. And that would be that. And there was no sense of a plan to it, just this unsubstantiated, fantastical vision. So there's all these weird, crazy thoughts now swimming in my mind. And I've become officially detached from the significance of why I'd moved to Estero and Fort Myers in the first place, which is to go to college. And to go to college somewhere where I could feel a sense of adventure. I was utterly detached from that. And so I dropped out. So I dropped out of college. And with the thought that what was going to happen was that I was going to move to England. I bought the plane ticket. I got the passport. I think I even found the hotel that I was going to stay at. And the idea was I would work that summer, take whatever money I had. My girlfriend and I at the time, we would just move. We would become expats. And that would be that. It didn't work out that way. The relationship actually ended. The details of that are all, I would keep that private for all parties involved. And just say that though the relationship ended, and though we didn't end up moving to England, that summer I spent making money. I said I didn't drop out of college, do a lot of work to make money, and emancipate myself from Florida Gulf Coast University and academia for nothing. So I said, okay, the adventure continues. I'm going to move to South Beach. That's where my girlfriend at the time, ex-girlfriend that I wanted to get back together with, that's where she lived. So I thought, okay, I'm gonna move to South Beach. So I'm gonna return to Florida because when we dropped out and I was working, I went back to New Jersey and stayed with, I think it was with my father. I can't remember if it was with my father or my mother anymore. Time is such a blur sometimes. So I wanted to go back to Florida and reignite the flame, if you will, and try to make that relationship work. So I moved to Miami Beach, South Beach, with the intention, there really wasn't much vision to it though. So there I am, this person who's like utterly traumatized by all the pot that he smoked, and with no sense of real purpose other than I'm gonna move to South Beach and see about bringing back this romantic relationship, or what I conceptualize as a romantic relationship, and work some job, and that would be that. And so you see how this chain of thoughts emerges, right? And the epistemology that naturally has to accompany this, right? Because there's no logic. There's no rule that says you have to vet this for contradictions, in my thinking at the time. There's no rule that says that it has to be somehow like healthy or conducive to my well-being. None of that. It's a combination of having expectations that certain things will occur as a matter of believing that it was fate that they would ultimately occur, in combination with a certain whimsicalness. Well, I feel like doing this. I'm not going to think it through, but I'm going to do it, right? Because there I am, having left Florida Gulf Coast, living back in Jersey, planning the move to South Beach after the move to England hadn't gone through, which, by the way, none of that was thought out. And there's no sense of like, where am I 5 years from now? Productively, economically, intellectually. There's just this very base, very unvetted desire to have the sense of adventure and therefore move to Miami because it was someplace. And I had an excuse to be there in particular because that's where the ex-girlfriend lived. And maybe we could fix that up. So that's the end of it. So very poorly thought out philosophical ideas and very poorly thought out particulars. And very few actual values at this time, other than just these few, very few, immediate impulsive desires. And all the while, right, other questions aren't being asked, like, should I have pursued starting this relationship back up? Just because the girl that I think that I want to start a relationship back up with lives in South Beach, does that mean that I should be in South Beach at this time? What about the world of South Beach, other than the sense of adventure, what is there that would be conducive to my well-being, or that would be in some way particularly and exceptionally good for me? And I'm gonna leave it there for now. What I'm going to tell you though is my move to South Beach becomes in some ways even darker than my move to Florida Gulf Coast University, because I become increasingly nihilistic, deeply nihilistic, and also a sort of very negligent and even destructive kind of person in certain respects. And it hurts me very deeply to have those memories in most respects, or in many respects. But it is my story, and it is a thing which I've managed to emerge from. And so again, here I am now in East Windsor, a place I fully understand how I've ended up here, or I understand it pretty well, and I understand the move that I want to make to Basking Ridge with my wife and why we want to move there, what that move means, and it's a much more vetted thing. So you see that interesting contrast. So once again, to be continued on this subject of moving someplace better, and I will talk to you more about it then. Have a great day. Bye.